And her name is Dr. Shainna Ali, and she is a licensed mental health counselor, educator, and mental health advocate.
Hi, thank you so much for having me with you today.
Absolutely. So Mary, you want to go ahead and get us started?
Sure. I just want to kind of open this conversation by kind of talking about what exactly is self-care and how it's different for all of us, because this can be a really individual concept. A lot of people want to put a single definition on it, but it really does vary between person to person. Shainna, do you want to share what self-care means for you?
Sure, and I really agree with you, Mary. I realized that in my practice, trying to help clients through, developing their own definition and even reflecting on my own, I've really come to recognize that self-care is something that we all need, but how we define it may be slightly different from person to person. So I love that this is where we're starting. And with that being said, when I share my definition, know that that's something that I developed over time, and I do tweak it here and there to match where I'm at, but it may not be what works for you. And, by all means, use your own definition or tweak yours to see if you like something that I share. But the way I define self-care is the act of recognizing and tending to your needs in the current context.
Okay. That's really helpful, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
go ahead. I was going to say I find that to be really true for me as well, especially honoring my feelings of what I'm feeling now, knowing what exactly I need in that moment, whether if I recognizing that I feel tired, I need to rest, I need to take a nap, or I'm hungry, I need food now. Even if I ate an hour ago, if I'm hungry, I have to eat. If I'm in the mood that I really need like a break from doing, really strenuous work, then I'm going to take a 15-minute break, and I'm just going to honor those needs, make sure that I'm taken care of so that I can continue doing what I need to do. That's how I really define self-care for myself.
I will jump in and say that in terms of self-care for me, one of the things I'm curious, I guess, about is with a lot of us who are in quarantine, for me, myself, like I definitely agree with you that the concept of self-care and the definition for each person is ever changing. And for me, that's really true. I used to not be able to like video games at all. Quarantine has really gotten me to a place where, especially because I've graduated, and so right now I'm not in school. So when I have free time, I am kind of just doing whatever I can with it. And it's actually become kind of a self-care activity for me. After a long day of work, I might go to video games, where if you'd asked me a year ago, I could not stand video games. Is that kind of an example of how it changes based on your situation?
Absolutely. So I think I love the examples that you both gave, and I love that they're varied, because I think that's important. Sometimes people think self-care looks like one specific thing, but in order to honor our unique selves, it may look different from me versus you. It could look similar, but it's different. And even for the same person, what I do for self-care today may not be what I do for self-care tomorrow. So the three ways I kind of break down that definition is first the recognition, right? So Mary was giving some really great examples earlier of like, if I'm tired, then I need to nap. Right? So the strategy is napping, but if she doesn't even recognize or validate the fact that she's tired in that moment, then it doesn't even give you that open door to walk through for self-care. So sometimes awareness gets overlooked, like it's not a big deal, but that is key, right? So then tending to, it's one thing to know, oh, I need this, but then honoring yourself to meet that need in some way. And that's where the last part comes in. And Faith, I think your example of video games comes in perfectly here, is the current context. So again, like I mentioned, what works for me in one day may not work for the other, but even if I have a similar context, something might be off. And that means that the strategy I used yesterday may not work for today. In the time of COVID, this is a really great point to make when it comes to self-care, because I've been seeing a lot of people struggle who were even using some sort of self-care practice, but they're trying to kind of copy and paste that practice in a global pandemic. And don't get me wrong, there are some great self-care strategies that can carry over well to this time, but a lot of it also requires an adjustment. We're in our new normal, right? So in many ways, that means tweaking our self-care to match our current context now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a great segue actually into another question I wanted to ask you, Dr. Shainna, which is for anybody who is by themselves in their home right now, or thrives in social interaction and is lacking that, do you have any strategies or self-care activities in particular that you would recommend for them?
Absolutely. So the first thing I would share about that is the fact that as human beings, we all need some level of connection, right? So all of us need some degree of that, even in this time. So some people need that more than others, especially if you tend to thrive in self-care activities that are more social and if you're extroverted. But I also want to recognize that we all need that to some degree. A common mistake that I've been noticing in the time of COVID is mistaking social distancing as social isolation. Now, some of the very key ways that we usually engage and get that need met of being involved with others, okay, those are limited, that's for sure. But instead of kind of Xing that off altogether, are there ways that you can tweak those needs to meet the current context? So, for example, I would much prefer getting together with a group of friends or family in person and enjoying that interaction. And especially throughout the last month, but even now with our guidelines, it still doesn't really allow for that to the capacity that I would like. However, now more than ever, I have used more video chats and all of the different ways, whether it's Zoom, FaceTime, whatever. There's a lot of ways that you can be creative about meeting that need. So I would encourage everyone who tends to be more social in their self-care to think about what were the ways that you used to meet that need and how maybe can it carry over with just some adjustments. So for example, if say in your working space, you got together with your colleagues every Friday night to get together and just kind of decompress and adjust into the weekend, then can you still do some sort of meeting like that in a virtual platform that can still meet that need? So just adjusting it in different ways. So honoring that the context is different. So instead of fighting with trying to control what you can't by this is what I cannot do anymore, use that energy to try to adapt.
And to kind of add to that, I really love what you just said, actually, because I think that you touched on, in my opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, that perspective is really important for a lot of people right now. And just that little shift in, it's not having to start something over, create something new, it's tweaking what you had. And that's not exactly a new normal, it's an adjusted normal. And that, I mean, for me, even that shifts my perspective a lot. On just being able to cope a little bit better with everything that, you know, has been going on.
Absolutely. I think if you look at self-care as either something I can do or I can't do, that's all or nothing thinking, right? So that's faulty thinking. So expanding your mindset to see things more on a gradient. I absolutely agree with you. I personally believe that perspective is power. So this is not to say to invalidate, you know,
Yeah.
I'm still sad I can't meet with my friends that way, right? So those are very valid experiences, and it's not to say that that loss and grieving process does not have its space that is warranted as well. Mm-hmm. But it's also helpful to shift to say, how can I adapt in this time? It's a great mental challenge for all of us. And I think that if you are open to the concept of recognizing that self-care needs to be adjusted to the context, no matter what the context is, mm-hmm. and in this time in which it's a global pandemic, and stress levels are high for so many people, and understandably so, then that means that our coping needs to rise to meet that stress level need and moderate and find balance. So adjustment is key.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that, because that makes a lot of sense. And I do appreciate you also touching on the importance of, you know, not invalidating anybody's feelings, because we are all allowed to have our hard days. And that's what our last speaker Dr. David Cavalieri really touched on, which was really helpful for, I think, both of us, Mary, if you agree.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and so kind of leading into my next question, which is a different population of for kids right now, this is a new normal for them, for a lot of them. So what about kids in this situation? What would you recommend for them as self-care activity and anything like that?
You know, I really appreciate you asking this question because it's obvious that kids are home with parents and caregivers and the rest of their families, but a lot of people are focused on how they can adjust because there are some basic needs that need to be met, right? Where is income coming from? When are we going to have food on the table? How can we keep a roof over our heads? Which are all important, but it is helpful to acknowledge that children are going through this too. So I think kids are a great actually inspiration for even adult self-care because kids are more likely to play and be creative and be imaginative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's what we need in this time. You know, we were just talking about adjusting self-care. So it's okay, if I can't meet my friends for dinner, then what can I do? Virtual dinner party, you know, so you need to use that creativity, and kids kind of tend to go to that already, right? So I would encourage those of us who are home with children, so whether it's parents, families, whatever, that are there ways that you can help them to still use their creativity in that space? Now, children have a lot of self-care that carries over really well. So, you know, playtime, dress up, coloring, all of those things carry over really well. But I also would encourage people to think of what are the creative self-care methods that you can do together. So are there things that as a family you can come together and have self-care time? Now, I know that some people think self-care means self though. So what do you mean do this with other people? And I think that's another misconception, at least from my definition of self-care. It's recognizing a need and tending to it in the context. That does not mean it has to be solo, right? So if my need is to connect and be creative, if someone else in my family needs to connect and be creative, can we meet both of these needs at the same time and support one another through it? So I think that that's a helpful way. So I would say that, you know, can parents color along with their children, right? Or even siblings, older siblings, can you play with your younger siblings in times like that? It's also helpful because if you have some sort of strategy that the child uses, like say they're having their playtime, you can, of course, play with them in that moment, but I also recognize that a lot of parents have a lot of responsibilities on their plate right now. So there can be some type of self-care, perhaps, that you can experiment with while they're playing there. Can you do another form of self-care if you're not playing with them? Maybe this looks like reading, maybe it's knitting, something that you're still present, right? But if you're not actively engaging with them, you can still watch and do something of your own too.
So get a breather for yourself at that point.
Exactly, because I understand that it's absolutely a luxury to say, you know what, go and do your self-care separate while you're having to watch your kids. A lot of people are dealing with not necessarily new roles, but their roles are now kind of overlapping at the same time under one roof, right? So how can I work but still watch my children too? So the reason why I give that strategy is not to say to disengage from your children. I just realize that there's a lot of responsibilities that are overlapping. So you still need self-care. So how can you be creative about maybe directly engaging with the children to play, be imaginative, or maybe be present, but also do something of your own so you can kind of model what self-care looks like. You know, this is time for me, this is time for you, but we're supporting one another in it. And of course, if there's the option to have someone else in the household that you can switch off, right? So maybe someone else, not just watching the child, but like partakes in play, right? And play is a great method for self-care, even as adults. Sometimes we think it's just for children, and that you can rotate. So switching shifts, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, one of my favorite things that you mentioned there was that children can be a model for adults during this time, because I feel like as adults, we've kind of forgotten how to self-care like children do. And I think that that's really powerful that right now we can look, usually our children, you know, they're the ones that are looking up to us as adults. And here, I think this is an instance where, yeah, we can definitely take some lessons from how they're serving themselves and they don't even realize it. Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, that,
in my opinion.
huh?
It's the beauty of being a child, in my opinion. Like I miss that, just that pure imagination, like being able to take a box and climb it and be like, I'm in a castle. And when you play with a child, you're absolutely right, in my opinion, Dr. Shainna, you're able to kind of tap into that. But again, as you said, also still finding that time to be able to take care of yourself at least somewhat, so that you're, again, able to take on the responsibilities that you have as a parent, or as if you're a sibling and you have school and all the other things that are just kind of overwhelming for you right now. It's important, I think, a lot of what you're saying is finding a balance of all of it.
Absolutely. And one thing I would add on top of that is that sometimes I experience a pushback from people who have a lot of responsibilities. How can you tell me self-care is important right now? Like, how can you dare add something else on my plate? I get why it could be helpful for people, but in my zone right now, I don't have the ability. And really, my heart goes out to people who are in that zone. I have a lot of compassion for that. That is difficult. And especially in this time, I know a lot of people have a lot on their plate at the same time right now. Now, I encourage, if you're in that zone, you're listening to this, like, how can I even, self-care is a luxury. It's not something that I have to do. I really believe that we all do need self-care, and we don't know how much we need it until we don't have it. So especially if it wasn't something that you were able to foster before, it can seem like an uphill climb, but I promise you it's worth it. It doesn't need to be in a way that, I think sometimes self-care, especially pre-COVID, a lot of the times it was marketed to us as something, like luxurious and expensive. It's a big spa day or taking a vacation across the globe. And sure, sometimes it could look like that, but will your needs actually be met by that one spa day or the trip across the globe, right? So maybe some types of needs, but some of your other needs are actually more simple and foundational. Doesn't mean that they're easy, but I think it's important that we don't overlook those. With that being said, when we invest in our self-care, it's not a selfish thing. We don't exist in a bubble. And for those of you who are home and household with people almost overlapping one another, you don't exist in a bubble. So know that the benefits of investing in your self-care, that's to be able to better take care of not just yourself, but others too, right? So we were talking about the notion of modeling and how in this unique time, we have children who can model creativity and imagination, and parents who can also model the importance of taking time for yourself and different strategies of self-care to meet your needs. And I just think this is a very clever exchange that this unique time is offering us. And know that when someone is taking care, whether it's the child or whether it's the parent, when they're taking time for self-care, that is not because they're trying to distance from anybody else. It's that they're meeting that need and finding their own balance so they can better connect with you too. So I think that's a really important message for everybody, but specifically for parents, because I know it's difficult to do that when all your roles are overlapping at one time. And it's important to know that you can't manage everybody else in your world, but the person you can manage the best is you. So if you start from you, then you can fill your cup so you can offer people in your life tips, I guess.
Yeah, kind of share your own experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of moving forward from that, we're talking a little bit about different populations or different ages that are affected right now. Mary, I know you had a question about essential workers.
Yeah, of course. What are your thoughts or recommendations for these essential workers that are working right now? There are some essential workers such as healthcare that this is kind of what they've signed up for, but then there are others that this, they had a regular, they had an everyday job where they didn't expect that this was going to be happening. What do you recommend for them for self-care?
Absolutely. This is a great question, because while I do believe we all need self-care, there are certain times and conditions that we need self-care more, right? And all of us need self-care more because we're in a global pandemic together. but essential workers are at that top list of really having self-care be essential. Now, I think that this group of people they're dealing with that angst a little bit more. It can be more difficult to think, how can I meet my self-care needs, right? And this goes to the notion of what I usually like to refer to as the self-care toolkit, right? Is the notion that there are things that you use for self-care that you can use in certain times and some you use for others. For essential workers, I would suggest that they come up with the strategies that they can use while they're working, right? So in that environment. So they may not be able to say, I'm tired and I'm going to take a nap right now, right?
Yeah.
But can you adapt that need to say, okay, can I use my break? Can I take a moment to center with breath work? I'm getting distracted with all my thoughts. Can I shift into gratitude practice? So I encourage essential workers to come up with a set of skills that really help them to find balance, energy, purpose, if possible, in the roles that they are taking that we need them to take on very much. With that being said, the shift is also when you come home from your essential job, right? So are there things you can do now in that zone that can help you to replenish? Of course, this is something that goes for everybody, but it's extra important for essential workers right now. So what do those things look like? And maybe those are things you already had in motion, but you build stronger boundaries around it, right? Mm-hmm. So at work, I have to be exposed to people all day. So when I'm home, I need some time that I can find that is more quiet and me by myself, right? So see what you can do to kind of adjust in that moment. Now, even kind of building on that example, well, I need quiet, I really want to relax, but my household is buzzing with the rest of my family. Well, they know you're an essential worker too. So are there ways that you can advocate for your needs and share, I'm working for us, and can you also help me? So seeking help, even that as a category, is self-care as well too. So again, essential workers are doing really incredible jobs right now. We need them. So we need them to not burn out. So knowing what you can do and trying different strategies for at work, again, breath work, grounding, taking a break. If you're sitting all the time, standing up. If you're standing all the time, sit down. Small tweaks that can be done at your work environment, and then things that you can do to replenish at home. Now, it's also important to realize that you might be trying to get to that level to balance your mental health, but because you're exposed to more stress by being an essential worker, that might be difficult. And I think it's important to recognize that for essential workers, or for anyone who's really trying with their self-care and are struggling, to note that, I'm speaking as myself as a private practice practitioner, but many of us in our local community are offering telemental health counseling at this time. So please don't think that help is not available for you because of the lockdown procedures that we are in. There are people that are available to help you. You guys know that very well.
No, thank you. And I really appreciated that little plug-in right there, because that is a lot of what we do with getting people connected to different resources. You make an excellent point on, telehealth and telemental health right now. And I think it's been really, if we're trying to find a silver lining in things that are going on, the accessibility to mental health services, I think, has increased even a little bit more, because before, a lot of practitioners were in office only. And if I'm in a small town, that either the nearest, therapy office or licensed mental health counselor is an hour away and I work, I can't get over there. But maybe now with, telehealth going on, it's a little bit easier to find somebody who's able to talk to you. And that might even, if they are closer, transition to, once this is all over, people might even continue doing telehealth because it does reach a larger section of your community. And so I really do appreciate you mentioning that. And one question, just real quick, that I'd like to know. So for those of us who are not necessarily an essential worker right now, let's say that we're working from home or we just live with somebody, you make a great point that these people, they need that extra self-care. So what can we do as their loved ones to ensure that they're getting that? What can we do to help with that?
Absolutely. And I love this question because the truth is, when you're helping someone else, that's automatically a boost to your well-being too. So it goes with that notion that self-care is not selfish. So if your need is to help someone else in that moment, right, especially if you're in a caregiver role or if you have a partner that you're residing with, even if it's your roommate, right, if your need is to kind of help that person, that can be self-care for you, and it can be a helpful offer for them as well. I think that this time really challenges our communication skills,
Yeah.
right? So earlier we were talking about how many of us meet our social needs by spending time in person, right? But now we have to adjust to how can you still communicate and connect virtually, right? And this is kind of that too with the communication is, well, I know I need self-care. I know it's harder now because we're facing a global pandemic. And then just the compassionate thought of, everyone in my life must also be dealing with some level of adjustment too. So communicating with others to check in on their needs, right? It might not occur to someone that how much they need self-care in that moment, even though it is pressing for them. So even having dialogue like this, like, how are you adjusting to meeting your needs at this time? Like, how are you doing? Even genuinely asking that question at this time with your loved ones, that can be helpful. And before they even ask, maybe you realize that there's something that you're doing that could help them. And especially if someone asks, that's the best way to know is, how can I help you, right? Directly asking them, how can I help you because you're doing this and I recognize that and I can't help you there, but can I do something else? And I think even just asking that question can be really helpful. Some examples that I can give from working and just even things I've been using is the shift. I was mentioning that before. So I'm really hearing a lot of parents take more of the shift role because they're home. So, you know, both parents are working, and how do you do that is, can you take, you know, houred blocks or more than an hour at times, depending on, you know, the age of the children and what their needs are, to then let someone have their time for either work, self-care, what have you, and someone who's being attentive to the children at that time. Also just knowing what your love languages are can be helpful. If you know, love an essential worker and you're home and they're going out, is what is their love language and how can you attend to theirs and honor yours at the same time too. It really is tailored, but I think the best way that you can really bridge that gap would just be to acknowledge the level of stress they must be under and ask, how can I help?
Yeah.
No, I definitely agree with you there. And I know we have time for a couple more questions because we are getting to our time. Is that right, Mary?
Yes. Yeah. So
go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say that question formally that we had just asked, and your answer, I think, just perfectly segues when we were talking about these essential workers being out and about in the field, how they care for themselves. I think it perfectly transitions into, how do people who are working from home, they're sort of experiencing this, now they've always had their office, their workplace, school be a separate place from their home. How do they make the transition and kind of make their home space feel relaxing and still like a place, like a sanctuary, instead of just a workspace?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And, you know, it speaks to the idea of like, whether you're an essential worker or you're working from home, whether you're a parent, whether you're a child, it's just really coming back to that notion that we all need self-care and we all need to adjust it in this time, right? To me, that just keeps echoing in our dialogue together. So for those of us who are working from home, like myself, I've transitioned to offering all of my counseling services through Zoom. I think it's helpful to know that we still could benefit from routine and boundaries. So when we're first adjusting to this, there may be that tendency to think that things are easier with that flexibility of, well, now I don't have to get up however much earlier to do all these things because they're happening in the same zone. But what happens from that is things start to blur together, and those boundary difficulties can just cause it to be one big loop instead of having distinct times for different activities. So one thing that I would suggest is coming up with some sort of new routine. Now, this does not mean that you have to have your schedule blocked out to the T. As much as I'd like to think that works, that does not work very well. I just know that for myself, and what I've noticed has helped for my clients is having some sort of, at this time I'm doing this, at this time I'm going to do this. I know I need to embed those breaks. So even writing that down, for me, I use my Google Calendar and I have my agenda in there, but I allow myself to kind of drag it around to move and adjust. So I needed longer for that walk today, or, you know, I finished that task sooner, so now I have bonus self-care time, right? So allow yourself to be flexible, but start to create a routine.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's helpful for that too, or to embed in the routine, are different types of boundaries. So a lot of people did not have a workspace at home and have had to create that. So I would encourage you to think about what was helpful about your workspace that you want to infuse in your current space, right? So one of the things, I thought about this really early, right before we had any of the social distancing guidelines, and I said, I really want my chair. So I brought home the chair from my office, the pillow from my office. Honestly, I really wanted to just kind of take my whole office and bring it home, but I couldn't, right? So the next best thing was, I want my chair. I do have, you know, work. This is my guest office, home office guest room. And it's makeshift, and I had a chair here, but it's better with my office chair. So, and that small difference, I can feel every day I sit down here, I'm like, thank goodness it isn't my other chair. So those small things can make a difference. Just little things for me make that difference. So the chair, the flowers, those are things that work in my office environment. And this is something I would also share for my colleagues, are what are the things that still make your space therapeutic? So sometimes I have my candle, sometimes I have my assistant therapist who is furry and adorable. Sometimes she comes in, and, you know, there's different things that you can still make your space work for you. But the reason why this is helpful is because it helps you to actually shift from the space. So you're not just switching to, now I am going to work. It's, I am physically getting up and moving into my workspace.
Mm-hmm.
Also helpful for breaks, right? So if you think, oh, well, I'm home, so I don't have to worry about when I drive home or walk home, right? No, then that can cause boundaries to blur in the opposite direction. There's too much work. And if all of those things are happening at one time, that could definitely be overwhelming, right? So I think that boundaries are also helpful in that way. So routine and boundaries are really key, but this is also a time to experiment with your self-care. What are the different things that maybe you weren't doing, but you want to do? Especially, someone else has a fluffy friend. I hear it in the background.
Yes.
And that's good. That made me smile, right? So you work with what you have, right? So work with what you have to create a workspace that kind of meets your needs in this time and helps you to find an adjusted routine in this new normal.
Mm-hmm. I really just, the point that you made about boundaries really resonates with me, because, you know, there's always that kind of urge when, even after you're clocked out, you kind of want to just take a peek at your emails and look, and maybe, oh, maybe I can get this one task done, even though it, you know, I've been done with work for an hour. So I think keeping that boundaries mindset in place is just, it's so helpful and so important.
Yeah, the other thing I would add to that too, right, is we are all adjusting. So sometimes I recognize that boundaries sound like a strong word, especially for those of us who may be new to that concept.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that we're building some new boundaries now, right? So being patient and kind with yourself in that process. Your boundary does not have to be a great big brick wall, right? For now, it can just be building a fence that sometimes you can open and be flexible and let somebody in. So being conscientious of that too, because while boundaries are important, it doesn't mean necessarily that you have to be really, really strict about it. I was talking before about that flexibility. And that really allows you to practice self-care, right? Because if self-care is recognizing and in order to tend to your needs, then being able to be flexible is important, because you might think that the certain routine is important as it is, and you may hold on to that in a very controlling way and do yourself a disservice by then ignoring how tired you are, or how distracted you are, or how hungry you are.
Mm-hmm.
No,
Yeah.
and I definitely agree with you there. And I think that your point on boundaries is actually a perfect segue into my last question for you. And so, again, just thank you so much for being here and taking the time to talk to us. Um, but in regards, I know you mentioned it earlier, we have a lot of Florida for sure, and a few other states or several other states are experiencing a slight change in the order that's recently been placed. I know in Florida, it's a slight lift on social distancing perimeters, referring to like restaurants are going to have outdoor seating, I think up to 25% capacity, and other places like that, or some smaller businesses might be opening again. It doesn't, it's kind of all subjective to different companies, things like that. But for those of us who see this, I think that one of the things you mentioned in boundaries and perimeters, how would you recommend that we find that balance of that slightly being lifted, but also protecting our mental and physical health? I know for me, I would love to just run to the beach or run to my best friend's house, but I'm still trying to keep in mind the fact that just because it's slightly lifted, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. So would you be able to touch on that a little bit?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to touch on that. And I think this is a great question. Starting a little bit backwards, you were pointing out that it doesn't need to be all or nothing. That's very important. Okay. So it doesn't have to mean just because I'm permitted to do this means I must do this, right? In that way. Going back to the definition that I was sharing earlier, and I've reiterated a few times, the way I see self-care is recognizing and tending to your needs in the context, right? So I'm going to bring the context one up to the forefront here, because that's what we're dealing with a lot in this time of COVID and with these new adjustments for the month of May. So sometimes our boundaries are given to us in our wider context, right? I think social distancing parameters, whether it's these new ones or the ones that we've been adjusting to, those are the boundaries that we abide by because they are within our context, right? But our boundaries are not just given to us by our social systems, they come from within in many ways too. So how can you balance the boundary of the one that exists in our social structure, so state, region, wherever you are, and also honor your needs? So for example, self-care during this time can also mean physical needs, right? So it takes up the wide domain of what well-being is. So for some people who are immunocompromised, or if you're an older adult, then even though these restrictions are being lessened, you are still in a group of high risk. And then how do you then recognize that that boundary has lessened, right? So I was using the example before of a gate. The gate is now a little bit open. Yeah, but does it mean that that you're going to benefit from walking through it, right? So I want everyone to pay attention, of course, to the guidelines that are around us in our community, because, our community is important to us. So you don't want to ignore whatever updated guidelines are, but also be true to you in that process too. So I think of especially the individuals who are at risk, that might still mean that you are dealing and behaving as if it's an older restriction, and that meets your need too, right? So being conscientious of what that means, and I think it's helpful to recognize that a way that you practice self-care is also for helping others, right? So if it means that you're going to put somebody else at risk, then being conscientious of that too.
Mm-hmm.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you very much for touching on that. Because it's something that I think all of us are, trying to just, again, adjust to with the
navigating.
I'm sorry, Mary?
I was just saying, yeah, we're all navigating it together for the first time.
Absolutely, and it's tricky, and I really empathize, because something that I thought of when this was happening, not as a counselor, as a person, was what about all these local businesses that I love and I won't be able to go to? And as a small business owner, of course, that really hit my heart. So it, for me now, to just use my example, right? My example doesn't have to be the same as anybody else's, but if I'm thinking about this new restriction, I still think about there are ways that I might be able to still support these businesses while still abiding by a level that I'm comfortable with in terms of exposure. So I think this is a wonderful way to kind of help the economy and get people who weren't able to work and start to stimulate that in that way. But also there are ways that we can be creative, right? So, you know, I've been supporting local a lot. I love to cook, but in this time, I think, well, my local businesses need it a little bit more. So I've kind of been using this as an opportunity to get a lot of takeout from my favorite local restaurants. And listen, I use that time that I don't have to cook for other things, right? So that's the context. So I just share that personal example because I understand that it's really difficult to navigate. Okay, well, this is what I'm allowed to do now. Am I comfortable with doing it? And I understand that we all have our own reasons why something might be the right thing to do or not for us, but you know yourself best. You know if you're at risk, you know if there's individuals around you that are at risk, and you know your needs and the needs of the community. So I trust that if you really spend time to reflect on that, you can find a way to practice self-care that aligns with all of those as well.
Mm-hmm.
No, thank you so much for that. And so I know that we've kind of hit our time. Is that right, Mary?
Yes, yeah. So we are approaching the 40-minute mark. So yeah, we do appreciate everything that you've come and you've shared with us. Yeah, we want to thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us. We really enjoyed having you.
Thank you so much for having me. I find this to be, you know, I'm really excited to be involved with this. I loved getting to chat with you all. And, you know, I think it's wonderful what you're doing for our local community. So I really, as a local, you know, private practice owner in Orlando, I'm really appreciative of your efforts. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, of course, of course.
Thank you so much. And so for anybody who's watching, we really appreciate your patience and working with us as we do take part in this new project. To give you guys a little bit of an update, we're going to be trying to post about 2 videos a week. So try to tune in Mondays and Fridays, and pretty soon we'll actually be posting a schedule so you can see in advance the people that we're going to be having on, the topics we're going to be discussing. And as we've said before, this whole purpose is really we want to get your input on what you want us to talk about, what what questions do you have related to a topic. And the whole idea is we just all want to be in this together. So with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, Mary, for hosting with me. And thank you so much, Dr. Shainna, for your insight and just talking with us.
Thank you so much.
Okay, all right.
Bye.
Bye. It was wonderful chatting with you.
Thank you.